công ty chuyên cung cấp công cụ kỹ thuật số cho cộng đồng y khoa tại Việt Nam với mục tiêu kết nối các bác sĩ Việt Nam với các chuyên gia y tế quốc tế. Buổi hội thảo lần này hân hạnh được chủ trì bởi bác sĩ Thomas D. Spring. Bác sĩ hiện đang là thành viên của American College of Physicians và Hiệp hội Lipid Quốc gia. Bác sĩ hiện tại đang làm việc tại Richmond. Ông từng là một trong những diễn giả được yêu thích nhất ở Hoa Kỳ với chuyên môn về bệnh xơ vữa động mạch. Trước khi bắt đầu, Medicenter xin có những lưu ý như sau. Buổi hội thảo lần này là một buổi hội thảo phi lợi nhuận mang mục đích trao đổi thông tin và chia sẻ kiến thức. Các kiến thức và quan điểm trong buổi thuyết trình ngày hôm nay là quan điểm của diễn giả và Medicenter sẽ không chịu trách nhiệm nào liên quan đến các thông tin được đưa ra. Xuyên suốt buổi hội thảo, xin mời quý vị gửi bất kỳ thắc mắc hay câu hỏi nào vào phần hỏi đáp là phần Q&A hoặc phần chat để được giải đáp vào cuối buổi. Và bây giờ xin mời mọi người đến với phần trình bày của bác sĩ. Hello, Dr. Thomas Dayspring. It is our honor to welcome you present today as our speaker. Now the audience is on yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone in Vietnam. It's early in the morning here in the eastern United States. So I'm going to be talking today about really the largest morbidity and mortality throughout the world nowadays, and that's atherosclerotic heart disease. So the only way we ever solve this problem is diagnose it very early in life and then take preventive measures. So there are many risk factors for atherosclerosis, and today we're going to be concentrating on the primary risk factor apart from age, which are lipid and lipoprotein concentrations. So over 100 years ago, the famous Russian, as a medical student, is the first one to describe the accumulation of cholesterol in the artery walls of rabbits. And there's his little drawing, as you can see. And those are basically macrophages that have filled up with cholesterol. They're called foam cells. And that is the typical histologic manifestation of atherosclerosis. This was back in 2010. William Roberts is the just retired editor of the American Journal of Cardiology. He's a very famous cardiac pathologist. He has dissected many hearts and is considered an expert on atherosclerosis. And in that journal, he wrote this provocative editorial where he just said, hey, it's the cholesterol, stupid. Said as a joke, but it's so important that there is no atherosclerosis if there is not any cholesterol in your artery wall. So understanding cholesterol becomes critical to the understanding of atherosclerosis. Now, there's what everybody is familiar with, our heart, and our heart gets its blood through coronary arteries and its tributations. Now, if you have a normal artery, it's basically a tube through which blood flows, and it flows freely. But in many people, unfortunately, over time, there is an accumulation of cholesterol in the artery wall, which causes what we call plaque. That plaque may or may not invade the arterial lumen and obstruct the artery. The biggest danger is if a clot develops on top of that plaque, then the artery is severely occluded and disease happens. The key concept to this whole lecture tonight is that the arterial acquisition of cholesterol is mediated by lipoproteins. There would be no cholesterol in the artery wall if lipoproteins carrying cholesterol did not leave plasma and enter the artery wall. Now, back around 1940, a laboratory technique called electrophoresis was in its early years of formation, and they started to apply it to proteins and, as you will see, lipoproteins. So originally they saw, hey, we can separate the various serum proteins depending on their electric charge. And they described beta, alpha, gamma proteins, as well as albumin. And you're going to see why that's so important, because as they refined the techniques over the years, they applied this electrophoretic separation to lipoproteins. And yeah, there are different types of gels on which they can do this procedure. But the originally described beta proteins, we now notice, hey, the beta proteins are associated with low density lipoprotein and very low density lipoprotein, whereas the alpha protein is associated with alpha lipoproteins, which are the HDL family of particles. So all of a sudden, we knew lipids are trafficking in plasma enwrapped by proteins, and it's the proteins that solubilize the hydrophobic lipids so they can circulate in our aqueous plasma. Now, this is a very famous, world-famous cardiologist from England who in 1958 published one of the early and best textbooks on the heart. And I want you to see what he concluded. He started off by saying, hey, the total serum cholesterol, which is normally around 150 to 300 milligrams per deciliter, is certainly related to atherosclerosis, but is found to be only a crude measurement of what's really going on with lipids. So he knew right away that cholesterol measurements in the blood are not going to be the best metrics. He went on to remind us that cholesterol is insoluble in water and is carried in combination with lipoproteins, which are invisible macromolecules of various sizes and densities. But his conclusion was, and remember, he's had electrophoresis back then, that atherosclerosis is due to an increase in the beta family of lipoproteins, even if your blood cholesterol measurements are normal. And this is so crucial because we see a lot of people today whose cholesterol measures are not that abnormal, but they have serious heart disease. And the moral of this story is we're going to have to more and more understand the lipoproteins that carry the cholesterol. So the next laboratory test that came along that helped us classify lipids and lipoproteins was ultracentrifugation, where you could separate lipoproteins depending where they wound up in a centrifuge tube. Did they float on top? Are they buoyant? Or did they sink to the bottom of the tube? Are they dense? So we can measure density of lipoproteins in a centrifuge. We also can measure the diameter of the different types of lipoproteins, from very small to very large. So if we apply both the density and the diameter, we're going to have a really good classification system of lipoproteins. And there they are. There are no other human lipoproteins than what you see here. You see very big ones and on the left, and you see very small ones on the right. Notice the very big ones to the left are the most buoyant lipoproteins. They don't sink very much in the centrifuge tube, whereas the small lipoproteins on the right are very dense and they sink to the bottom of the tube. Hence, we got the name, and this technique was first published around 1950, very low density, intermediate density, low density, and high density lipoproteins. And those are names we're all familiar with now. We use abbreviations, VLDL, IDL, LDL, and HDL. But now let's look at them separately. All the ones that have that greenish background there are the beta lipoproteins, and they are characterized by their surface protein, which is a single molecule of apolipoprotein B, called ApoB for short. Notice every single particle has one molecule of ApoB. That makes it easy to measure in a laboratory, because if we would just measure ApoB, we would be counting the number of beta lipoproteins that exist in a certain volume of plasma. On the lower right are the alpha lipoproteins, and the big difference is their structural protein is called apolipoprotein A1. There is no ApoB on any of the HDL particles. So you can get a blood test called apolipoprotein A1, and that is a way of counting the number of high-density lipoproteins. I want to show you a little bit more about the anatomy of a lipoprotein. These are the basic lipids that you will find on the surface or in the core of a lipoprotein. On the top left, you have unesterified, it's called free cholesterol. And the bottom right, you have the storage or trafficking form of cholesterol called cholesterol ester. The difference is if you look on the top left, you see that green hydroxy group. And on the bottom right, you see that hydroxy group has been replaced with a fatty acid. That makes cholesterol ester very hydrophobic. So it will be found in the core of lipoproteins. Free cholesterol will be on the surface of the particle. Phospholipids, top right, also have some degree of water solubility. So like free cholesterol, they are found on the surface of lipoproteins. But bottom left, you see the very hydrophobic way in which we traffic fatty acids. 3 fatty acids are esterified to a glycerol molecule, and that is called, of course, triglyceride or triacylglycerol. So none of those can circulate in plasma because they all have some degree of hydrophobicity. However, there we show how they congeal together. You basically form oil droplets consisting of the 2 types of cholesterol, phospholipids, and triglycerides. Now, they could not exist in plasma. They're too hydrophobic. But if we wrap them with proteins, we now have water-soluble lipid transportation vehicles, which, of course, are called lipoproteins. And the proteins that enwrap the particles are called apolipoproteins. I've already taught you about ApoB and ApoA1. And of course, we classify them by their density, VLDL, LDL, and HDL. That bottom graphic is the key point of today's lecture. Lipids go nowhere in the human body unless they're carried with inside a lipoprotein. And this is why it's going to be so crucial to better understand lipoprotein measures that a laboratory can provide rather than lipid measures. Complicating this situation is you see those arrows going back and forth between the particles. Continuously while they are circulating, they interact with each other and they exchange their core lipids. Particles exchange a molecule of cholesterol ester for a molecule of triglycerides. So the composition of these particles is subject to continuous change. Now, the ones we worry about are the ones that can leave plasma, enter the artery wall, and deposit their cholesterol. Those are the potentially atherogenic lipoproteins. Those are the ones that if this happens in one of your patients, cholesterol winds up in the artery and they will over time develop atherosclerosis. So the beta lipoproteins that are capable of generating plaque are small chylomicrons, they're called remnants, smaller VLDL, they're called remnants, intermediate density, low density, and a subfamily of LDL particles called lipoprotein little a. Notice the HDL particle is still floating in plasma. That does not enter the artery wall and contribute cholesterol to the plaque. So HDLs are not in the family of atherogenic lipoproteins. It's the ApoB particles that have the ability to do harm. So a close-up look at the ApoB family. There they are. But really, how important they are depends on their plasma residence time, their half-life. The longer they exist in plasma, the more the potential is that they can crash the artery wall. So if you look, you see chylomicrons are basically a postprandial particle that enter the blood after you eat, and they rapidly get catabolized. So they are not a major contributor to the ApoB concentration. You can see VLDLs have a longer plasma residence time, but the one that floats around the longest are our low-density particles. Their half-life is 2 to 3 days. Their plasma residence time can be 4 to 5 days. So the key thing to know about, if you measure ApoB, you are counting all of those particles, but 90% of the ApoB particles are low-density lipoproteins, and that's why we give such importance to LDL metrics. This is another graphic just to visualize what goes on. You see an artery lumen. You see the artery wall is covered by endothelial cells. For a lipoprotein carrying cholesterol to wind up in the artery wall, it has to pass through the endothelial cells. Here we see again the ApoB family of particles, 90% of which are LDLs. Those are the particles that can enter that artery wall. Remember the concept, lipids are trafficked in lipoproteins. So if cholesterol winds up in your artery wall, the only way it got there is an ApoB particle, the majority of which are LDLs, left plasma and deposited it in your artery wall. And we know that the probability that a particle's cholesterol will be delivered to your plaque depends largely on LDL particle number. And that is measured by recording ApoB, because LDLs are by far the most predominant ApoB particle. Once they're in the artery wall, the particles aggregate, they oxidize, and they get internalized by macrophages, creating those foam cells that Dr. Anichkal described in Russia 100 years ago. But it's the particles entering the artery wall that are carrying the potentially damaging cholesterol molecules. Now, the other key part to this is, how do they crash the artery wall? You do not have to have an abnormal endothelium for that to happen. As you can see, there are different pathways for ApoB particles to leave plasma and enter the intimal layer of the arteries. Paracellular leak, small spaces between endothelial cells, or there are actually pathways through which these particles can transcytose, move through the endothelial barrier. And the key concept for plaque, fibrotic changes to occur in the artery wall, it takes time. Atherosclerosis takes many years, if not decades, to develop. And this is why we now recognize the earlier in life that we understand, wow, this person has a lipid abnormality, we can take care of the problem long before atherosclerosis ever develops to any serious degree. And that's why all the pediatric societies are now recommending lipid testing by the time you're 7 to 9 years old, some even earlier before that age if there's a strong family history. So it takes time for this disease to happen. The good news is the earlier you discover it, you will have plenty of time to correct the lipid or lipoprotein abnormality. So let's start in the liver, which is the primary producer of the ApoB particles. So you start with fatty acids and glycerol. They join together to form mono, diacyl, and triacyl glycerides. Triglycerides are going to wind up in a lipoprotein because they are pulled together with cholesterol and cholesterol ester and phospholipids, and the liver creates this big triglyceride-rich lipoprotein called the VLDL. Its primary purpose is to bring fatty acids in the form of triglycerides to your muscles where they can be used for energy. Once the VLDL enters plasma, it has other apoproteins on its surface which bind to the triglyceride dissolving enzyme lipoprotein lipase, and the fatty triglycerides become fatty acids which enter the muscle cells and are then oxidized for energy creation. As the VLDL loses triglycerides, it becomes smaller, smaller, and smaller, ultimately becomes an intermediate density lipoprotein. Their primary purpose was to deliver triglycerides. So once they do that, LDL receptors in the liver bind to the ApoB or the ApoE that is on them and rapidly clears them into the liver, or they are catabolized. However, in the plasma, some of the IDLs are exposed to a different lipase called hepatic lipase, removes surface phospholipids and remaining triglycerides, creating the smallest ApoB particle, which is the low-density lipoprotein. This takes 2 to 3 to 5 days to be cleared, mostly because, unlike its predecessors, it does not have ApoE on its surface. But ultimately, the LDL will be cleared at the LDL receptor. And this slide visualizes the liver cell manufactures LDL receptors, which extend into the plasma. They bind to the ApoB on the particles. They internalize them. The particles are catabolized. The cholesterol can be used to make bile acids, and both bile acids and cholesterol are then excreted into the bile duct and brought down to the intestine. That is a major, major avenue of cholesterol homeostasis. The internalization of ApoB particles is called clearance. And all of the drugs we now use to improve either cholesterol or ApoB concentrations act by making the liver express more LDL receptors or extend the half-life of existing LDL receptors. But you must also understand this. Yes, the majority of the LDLs come as VLDL particles are catabolized, but a significant number of your LDLs are created in the liver and simply excreted as LDL particles. That's called direct LDL secretion. If you have normal lipids, about 40% of your LDL particles were directly produced in the liver and excreted. They are not a result of VLDL catabolism. As triglycerides goes up, the liver makes more VLDLs than LDLs, but still almost a third of your LDLs under conditions of high triglycerides are secreted by the liver. So a key concept is not all LDLs are the product of VLDL catabolism or lipolysis. This was published last year in JAMA Cardiology based on a big study, and this is the editorial, which basically declared the debate is over. And the editorialist, Alan Snyderman, says trapping of ApoB particles is the fundamental cause of atherosclerosis. And the number of ApoB particles in plasma is the most important driver of atherosclerotic development. ApoB can be measured directly and accurately and better predicts atherosclerotic risk than does looking at LDL cholesterol or non-HDL cholesterol measures. Of course, the overwhelming majority of clinicians throughout the world are measuring lipid concentrations like LDL-C or non-HDL-C, but more and more ApoB is starting to take center stage. Thus, ApoB should be the primary measure of to determine the atherogenic risk of the ApoB particles, and it also becomes the goal of therapy. So, what are the lipoprotein metrics that are available? Now, their availability depends, it varies from continent to continent or country to country. In the United States, these tests are all readily available. That is less so in other countries around the world. But any lab can do apolipoprotein B. It's a very simple assay. And if you order that, you will see it is reported in concentrations. And here you see both some molar and milligrams per deciliter concentrations of what apolipoprotein B should be. If you are measuring ApoB, you are quantitating all those particles that you're looking at there. But remember, 90% of ApoB is LDL particles. So you can actually make the case that ApoB is an LDL-P, LDL particle metric. The most recent European guidelines for the people who are at the highest risk, who have atherosclerotic disease and have had an event, it is desirable to have an ApoB under 55 milligrams per deciliter. All right, but most physicians throughout the world do lipid profiles, lipid panels. Now, as you are likely very familiar with, total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and non-HDL cholesterol. Understand those are lipid measures. They are not lipoprotein measures. Those values represent the amount of lipids that are within various lipoproteins. And most people focus a lot on LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. However, guidelines only use two lipid concentration metrics as goals of therapy. Guidelines want us to normalize LDL cholesterol values and, perhaps more importantly, non-HDL cholesterol values. It is crucial to point out that there is absolutely no HDL cholesterol goal of therapy, nor can triglycerides serve as a goal of therapy. In general, we like to lower triglycerides, but there is no triglyceride level at which you can say there is no longer any atherosclerotic risk. So we're going to concentrate on LDL-C and non-HDL-C. And as you're going to find out, those are basically poor man's guesstimates of ApoB. So let's look at total cholesterol. You're looking at all the lipoproteins that exist in plasma. So if we just measure the cholesterol that is in all of those particles per deciliter of plasma, that is what a total cholesterol level is. It's used in risk assessments. It's used as a screening tool, but it is not a goal of therapy. If you look closely, you will figure out that about 80% of total cholesterol is not in an HDL particle, it's in the ApoB particles, primarily the LDLs. So total cholesterol is a guesstimate, a surrogate concentration that represents ApoB. So if you just start with total cholesterol and already it's high, you should suspect that there is an ApoB excess in this patient. These are the standard in milligram per deciliter references for it. But to be honest with you, if there's other risk, as a total cholesterol goes above 150, you should start to suspect there may be too many ApoB particles. All right, now let's look at low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is, depending how you measure it, either the cholesterol in your LDLs or your LDLs plus intermediate density lipoproteins. Most laboratories use an equation to calculate this. LDL-C is equal to total cholesterol minus HDL cholesterol plus triglycerides divided by 5. There are many laboratories who don't use the calculation. They directly measure LDL cholesterol. The calculated LDL cholesterol becomes less accurate as triglycerides goes up and up, and you should not use calculated LDL-C as the triglycerides start to go much above 300 or 400 milligrams per deciliter. That is the case where you either want to measure direct LDL-C or do an ApoB. LDL-C also includes, if a patient has them, the cholesterol within Lp(a) particles. We'll talk about them later. That's an inherited abnormal type of lipoprotein. And unless your level is very high, it's not a major contributor to your LDL cholesterol level. But in people with very high Lp(a), it is a contributor to the LDL cholesterol value. Of course, LDL cholesterol is called bad. That is actually erroneous because most of the LDL particles that carry cholesterol are actually cleared at the liver, and the liver gets rid of the cholesterol. So that is certainly not bad. Where it becomes bad is if an LDL carries it into your artery wall. All right, next is HDL cholesterol, which is you on your left, you see the HDL particles, and on the right, you see the mass of cholesterol molecules they're carrying per unit volume. There are gender differences with HDL metrics because once we enter puberty, testosterone lowers HDL where estrogen increases it. HDL cholesterol has nothing to do with the process called reverse cholesterol transport, and it has nothing to do with the functionality of HDL particles. And we now understand that HDLs can confer cardioprotection in many people, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with the cholesterol that is in the HDL particles. It's much more related to other lipids that are in the particles and to the specific proteins that are trafficked on HDL particles. Of course, it's commonly referred to as good cholesterol, but that is also erroneous because once an HDL acquires cholesterol, it traffics, shares it with LDLs through one of those lipid transfer proteins. So an HDL full of cholesterol sends about half of its cholesterol content over to an LDL, and the LDL returns the cholesterol to the liver. So, but that LDL could also take the cholesterol it acquired from an HDL and bring it to the artery wall. So we should no longer use the terms good and bad cholesterol. All right. If we want to look at lipoproteins that reflect high-density lipoproteins, there is a technology that will report HDL particle concentration in micromoles per liter. You could measure apolipoprotein A1, which is an estimation of HDL particle number. And the reason it's not terribly accurate is HDL particles have variable numbers of ApoA per particle, from 1 to 5. So you can see that would somewhat lessen the accuracy of measuring ApoA1. If you really want to have an HDL particle count, nuclear magnetic resonance or ion mobility transfer are the assays that one should use. Now let's get to triglycerides. Remember, 3 fatty acids on a glycerol molecule. You see all of the lipoproteins there. We don't measure lipoprotein triglycerides, do we? Well, actually we do. When a lab reports triglycerides to you, it is basically every triglyceride molecule that is in every lipoprotein. Most are in VLDLs, and lesser amounts are in LDLs, and only a few in HDLs. But HDLs do carry some triglyceride molecules. So triglycerides is sort of like total cholesterol, is the cholesterol in all the particles. Triglycerides is the triglyceride content in all the particles. You typically fast for triglyceride levels because they go up transiently after a meal before returning to their steady state level. I've now outlined the ApoB triglyceride levels to you, which are in the VLDLs, IDLs, and LDLs. They would be interesting measures, but that's a research tool right now to measure that. What surprises most people is that there are triglycerides in an HDL. And imagine for a minute if for whatever reason your patient's HDL were carrying extra triglycerides. The more triglycerides they carry means there's no room for cholesterol. And this is why as triglyceride levels goes up, HDL cholesterols go down because the particle, the HDL, is carrying something it should not, triglycerides, at the expense of cholesterol. Now, when a VLDL particle carrying all those triglycerides comes out of the liver and enters plasma, it bumps into your LDLs and HDLs. Using the lipid transfer protein, cholesterol ester transfer protein, Triglycerides are swapped for cholesterol molecules. As this process goes on, the LDLs and the HDLs lose some of their cholesterol and transfers it to the VLDLs. Meanwhile, the VLDL has lost some of its triglycerides and sent it over to the LDLs and HDLs. So you wind up on the left with triglyceride depleted, cholesterol-rich VLDLs. As that is exposed to lipoprotein lipase at muscles and fat cells, the triglycerides are removed and you develop a small VLDL, but is now carrying many, many molecules of cholesterol. Every VLDL particle on average can carry 7,000 to 8,000 molecules of cholesterol. The LDL carries much less, the HDL, very few. A typical HDL particle maybe has 45 molecules of cholesterol, and LDL around 2,000. The LDL is subject to hepatic lipase. So if an LDL has extra triglycerides and is cholesterol depleted, when you undergo lipolysis with hepatic lipase, you generate the small LDL particles. The small LDL particles are not efficiently cleared by LDL receptors in the liver, so they accumulate. The persons most likely to have excess small LDLs are people with insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, because those are the patients who have subtle elevations in triglyceride levels. So triglycerides at the end of the day is going to generate increased ApoB, increased LDL particle counts. In some cases, LDL cholesterol actually goes down, but if you're measuring ApoB, you see despite the normal LDL cholesterol, there is considerable lipoprotein risk remaining. I'm going to show you 4 different LDL particles. On the left is a normal one. It's normal size, and it has about 20% triglycerides, 80% cholesterol. You see in red that particle will have 2,600 molecules of cholesterol. On the right is the small LDL particle. The volume of a spear is 1/3 power of the radius. So small LDLs it takes up to 40% more small LDLs to traffic a given level of cholesterol. Why? Look how many molecules of cholesterol are in the small LDL compared to the big one. Only 2,150. So it takes a lot more small LDLs than big LDLs to traffic whatever cholesterol is in the LDLs. But look at this. There's a very big LDL, but it's quite blue, meaning it's triglyceride enriched. Look how many cholesterol molecules are in it. The same as are in the small LDL, far less that are in the normally composed LDL on the left. And the worst scenario is a small LDL that is still triglyceride rich. They carry very few cholesterol molecules, and they are the people who have extremely high ApoB levels. But because they're not carrying much cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol is not very high. So they're easy to miss if you're just measuring LDL cholesterol. The bigger particles historically have been called pattern A and the smaller pattern B. There are less cholesterol molecules as triglyceride accumulates or as the particle gets smaller. And that is what causes confusion. That is what makes LDL cholesterol not so elevated, but makes LDL particle count, or ApoB, very high. Now let's concentrate on the HDL particles. Notice the HDL has some blue in it. It's acquired triglycerides from the VLDL. As it is exposed to further enzymes, the HDL becomes smaller, smaller, and smaller. And this is why HDL cholesterol goes down as triglycerides goes up. Ultimately, the HDL particles, if they're very small, are catabolized at the liver, and HDL particle count, ApoA1, goes down, especially when triglycerides goes up. There is a normal HDL particle. You see very few triglyceride molecules represented in blue. But under conditions of insulin resistance, diabetes, the HDL acquires triglycerides. That means it has no room to carry cholesterol, explaining the relationship between high triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. And that triglyceride-rich HDL is much more prone to catabolism in the plasma and excretion in the kidneys. This is a very powerful slide. On the bottom, you see triglycerides going up, up, up. On the left is LDL particle count, ApoB. And notice that when your triglycerides hits 150, your LDL particle count, or ApoB, is likely in the high risk range. And that is the real reason why triglycerides are such a risk factor. Triglycerides means increased ApoB, regardless of what your LDL cholesterol is. This is an important slide explaining why ideally one measures ApoB, or LDL particle count, and LDL cholesterol. In general, they correlate, but let's take an LDL cholesterol of 100. And now let's see what are the possible LDL particle number, or ApoB. Well, it might be 1,000 nanomoles per liter of LDLs, which is normal. So the LDL-C of 100 and 1,000 sort of correlate with each other. The risk is not that high. But some people with an LDL cholesterol of 100 will have extremely low ApoB, or LDL particle count. Their risk is much lower, despite their LDL cholesterol of 100. And there are some with what is a seemingly okay LDL cholesterol that will have a terrible LDL particle number, or ApoB. So even though their LDL-C is not that scary, their cardiovascular risk is extremely high. Is there a triglyceride level that might be ideal? Guidelines tell us, hey, triglycerides become risk at 153 milligrams per deciliter. The truth is, triglycerides, if you want them to be physiologic, should be well under 100 milligrams per deciliter. So, and most people do not have such low triglycerides. What happens as HDL cholesterol drops to your ApoB, or LDL particle number on the left? Wow. Once your HDL-C goes below 40 milligrams per deciliter, that's probably around 1 millimole per liter, look where your LDL particle count is. Very high risk. So the real reason low HDL cholesterol is associated with cardiovascular risk is, in almost all cases, ApoB, or LDL particle count, is very high. And the goal of therapy in people with low HDL cholesterol is to normalize your LDL metrics: LDL cholesterol, LDL particle count, ApoB. Finally, the last metric in a lipid profile is called non-HDL cholesterol. As the name implies, it is the cholesterol that is not in your HDL particles. That means it's in the ApoB particles. So non-HDL cholesterol is just a term representing ApoB cholesterol. It's the best surrogate in the lipid profile of apolipoprotein B. And it's a calculation. You take total cholesterol, you subtract from it HDL cholesterol, you are basically left with the VLDL and LDL cholesterol, your ApoB cholesterol. So it is the best guesstimate in a lipid profile that alerts the clinician that there is an ApoB situation here. And even if you have normalized LDL cholesterol, it is critical to normalize the non-HDL cholesterol. That's much harder to do, and oftentimes, apart from more aggressive lifestyle, it takes combination lipid modulating drugs. Finally, I want to wrap up the talk with this inherited type of lipoprotein. On the left, you see an LDL. On the right, you see there's another protein attached to the ApoB, and that is called apoprotein little a, small a. It's not a capital A. You only have that if you inherited the genes from mother and father. It's a codominant inheritance, and your liver produces ApoA. If your liver produces ApoA in excess, it is attached to the LDL particles, creating an LP little a particle. That is a much more dangerous, a much more potentially atherogenic particle than the LDL on the left, because that ApoA has prothrombotic properties, and it also carries oxidized lipids, which are toxic to cells, including the arterial wall. There are different ways of measuring LP little a, and the assays vary from country to country. You will either get it reported in milligrams per deciliter or nanomoles per deciliter, although the molar concentration is much preferred. But not every lab is equipped with that assay. Here, further dissecting LP little a particles, researchers can actually measure the mass of ApoA on the particles. Other labs report LP little a mass, which is the molecular weights of everything in those particles, the ApoA, the ApoB, the cholesterol, the triglycerides. But the more Apo little a you have, the higher will be your LP little a mass or your LP little a particle count. On the right, you see LP little a cholesterol. That's basically a research tool that's not widely used in any country throughout the world. But do notice across the bottom, if you are looking at all your LDLs, LP little a is a minority particle. Most of your LDLs, even if you have the wrong gene, do not carry apolipoprotein A. But it is so atherogenic that you don't need that many LP little a particles to cause problems. These are this was just published. The European Atherosclerosis Society just issued a new guideline regarding LP little a. And you can see that this does vary by ethnicity and race. And I've included the South Asian concentrations for you, as well as what you will, those of us see in North America here. You might be shocked to hear this, but guidelines now recommend that this should be measured in every person early in life, but you only need once per lifetime measurement because it's a genetic issue. It doesn't change. So right now, whenever you do a first lipid profile on a person, if they haven't had it, they need an LP little a concentration. This is from that recent guideline. Measurement of LP little a should be considered at least once in each person's lifetime, if available, to identify people who have inherited an extremely elevated level of LP little a. And you see the concentrations there. It's a killer LDL particle. And the early you recognize it, the more aggressive you can be in lowering ApoB. Likewise, the National Lipid Association recommends its rather routine measurement. So I'm going to wrap up by this summary slide, which shows you every conceivable lipid or lipoprotein metric that is available to people. And of course, it varies country to country and even locations in various countries. The ApoB particles are on the top left, the ApoA1 particles, top right. Triglycerides are the trigs in all of those, and the cholesterol is the cholesterol in all of those. So this is a handy little reference on that. So I hope you enjoyed all these evolving concepts on lipids and lipoproteins. I am a very active use of Twitter with providing lipid and lipoprotein education. So if you use Twitter, go look up @DrLipid. So I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dayspring. We will now move on to the questions received from our audience today for your talk. And I'll kindly introduce Dr. Tùng. He will translate for this section. Trân trọng cảm ơn bác sĩ Dayspring về phần chia sẻ vừa rồi. Chúng tôi xin phép chuyển sang phần hỏi đáp với những câu hỏi được quý vị khán giả gửi về cho chương trình. Và bây giờ xin mời bác sĩ Tùng sẽ phiên dịch cho phần hỏi đáp ạ.
Thank you again, Dr. Daisy. So we will move on to the very first question. Um, can you elaborate on the class of lipoprotein that is proactive against the atherosclerosis?
Listen, our connection is not that good. I didn't understand exactly what you're asking.
Can you explain more about the class of lipoprotein that protect against the atherosclerosis?
I think you're asking me about protection. If there's a lipoprotein that protects against atherosclerosis, it's to have very few ApoB particles, but to also have what we call functional HDL particles, which carry proteins that afford cardioprotection. But we unfortunately have no lab tests that can tell us whether an HDL has good or bad functionality. So we just don't have such tests.
Bác sĩ đây Spring bảo là trong cái hiện tại thì vẫn không coi rằng cái DDR nó là một cái lipoprotein thuốc để bảo vệ cho cơ thể người khỏi cái bệnh siêu hấp mạch, nên là hiện người ta đang nghiên cứu nhiều về các cái lipoprotein, là cái lipoprotein B hơn là cái lipoprotein.
I just can't understand what you're saying with the connection. It's not coming through very clear to me, so I don't know what you just asked me.
Can you hear me?
Not very well.
So I think I can you hear me well?
Yes, you're better.
Yeah, so maybe I will read the question in English and then Tùng will translate to Vietnamese for our audience. Is that better?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. So do you want me to reread the previous question?
If I didn't answer it properly, sure.
Yeah, so the question is, can you elaborate on the class of lipoproteins that is protective against the atherosclerosis?
Yeah, I think I did answer that. The only lipoprotein that can be protective against atherosclerosis is HDLs. But the problem is some HDLs are protective, some are not. And it all depends to everything other than the cholesterol it carries, what proteins or what phospholipids it carries. They are not routinely measured in the blood. So we have no blood test that tells us about HDL protection or lack of protection. The only way right now we can prevent atherosclerosis is to make as low as possible the number of ApoB particles. They are the ones that cause the damage. If you make their concentration very low, you don't need HDLs.
Thì bác sĩ có bảo là cái HDLC thì tuy và tuy rằng là người ta bây giờ nói rằng HDLC này nó có cái giá trị gọi là cholesterol tốt, nhưng mà thực ra là câu chuyện nó liên quan đến việc là HDLC này nó chở cái cholesterol nào đi, và hiện tại cái điều chúng ta cần làm là nó cái beta là cái hạt beta lipoprotein thấp thôi, chứ còn cái việc mà đo lường HDLC nó cũng phải là việc làm thường quy và cũng không có đấy.
All right, thank you. So now we'll continue with the next question from Anh Vũ in the chat. So Anh is a pharmacist, not a doctor, and they asked, can you please give them more ideas about the value of HDLC factor? As you know, based on the guideline of ESC 2016, they show that decreasing 1% LDL-C would reduce 1% CV events, the same efficacy as increasing of 1% HDL-C. So why was HDL-C not the target of this treatment therapy as LDL-C? We can consider if there are any factors which can increase the HDL-C index, right?
And this is the big thing that has changed. Although HDL cholesterol can be used as a predictive lipid risk factor, in general, as I tried to show on the one slide, when HDL cholesterol goes down, ApoB goes up. So HDL-C is not an independent predictor of risk and cannot be used as a goal of therapy. There is not a single guideline in the world that provides an HDL cholesterol goal of therapy. The goals of therapy are to lower ApoB, LDL cholesterol, and non-HDL cholesterol. So you should not be using HDL cholesterol other than an initial suspicion that cardiovascular risk is elevated. It is not a goal of therapy. There is no drug or therapy that raises HDL cholesterol and provides cardioprotection. But all of the lifestyles and drugs that lower ApoB do provide cardioprotection. So we have to drift away from HDL-C and use LDL-C, non-HDL-C, and ApoB. The only real thing you use HDL-C for is the calculation to determine non-HDL cholesterol. Otherwise, stop concentrating on HDL cholesterol and stop trying to raise it.
Bác sĩ bảo là cái giá trị của HDLC chỉ là một việc để tính non HDLC thôi. Còn theo các guideline thì cái chỉ số mà người ta sử dụng là McDill thì bao gồm ba thứ, đấy là ApoB, non HDLC và LDL. Thì cái non đã không sử dụng HDLC nhưng một cái macro lâm sàng để điều trị, đấy là vì cái macro độc lập mà nó bị ảnh hưởng bởi ApoB. Thì bác sĩ đã bảo là ở trong cái slide trước của bác sĩ thì một cái slide nó sẽ giải thích đấy là trong cái trường hợp mà nó tăng ApoB thì suy nó mình xem, nên là hiện tại thì đã đây là tôi chỉ có giá trị để dùng để tính non HDLC thôi.
All right, thank you, Boom. And now I'll continue with the question from our Q&A. Can you tell us about which drug of choice for treating the atherosclerosis? Is the novel drug like PCSK9 inhibitor work well enough?
Yes, the drugs that we use to lower ApoB are drugs that make the liver cells increase the expression of LDL receptors, because those receptors grab the circulating ApoB particles and pull them into the liver, which means they cannot go enter the artery wall. So the drugs that make the liver increase expression of LDL receptors are statins, which inhibit cholesterol synthesis, ezetimibe, which inhibits the absorption of cholesterol. The liver's response to both of those drugs is to make more LDL receptors, so they lower ApoB, either alone or often in combination therapy. There is a new cholesterol synthesis inhibitor available in certain countries called bempedoic acid, which is like a weak statin. It also increases LDL receptors. The drug that was asked about were the PCSK9 inhibitors, which are the most potent class of drugs that lower ApoB. What they do is they extend the residence time of any LDL receptors that are in the liver. Those drugs prevent catabolism of LDL receptors. So your LDL receptors stay around for a long time and they dramatically clear ApoB particles. Almost always PCSK9 inhibitors are used in combination therapy with statins or with ezetimibe or with all three. And of course, the limiting factor with PCSK9 is they are extremely expensive. and third-party payers usually do not cover them unless the patient has familial hypercholesterolemia or very severe atherosclerotic heart disease. But if you have a patient who can afford a PCSK9, they are very potent and very safe ways of lowering ApoB.
Rồi tiếp theo là câu hỏi về cái đầu tay lựa chọn để điều trị chữa động mạch, và cái vấn đề về một thuốc mới đấy là nhóm thuốc PCSK9 inhibitor. Thì bác sĩ có bảo là thuốc đầu tay thì của bác sĩ là statin, bởi vì là nó sẽ giúp là tăng cường cái việc mà gan nó không phải LDL đưa và giảm UV xuống. Còn về thuốc nhóm thuốc mới PCSK9 thì đây là một nhóm thuốc có cơ chế, đấy là nhóm thuốc này kéo dài thời gian của các LDL receptor ở trên tế bào gan, vì làm cho cái việc mà tế bào gan lấy các cái LDL và thay lại nó đi thì sẽ hơn và mạnh hơn. Thì đây là một nhóm thuốc rất mạnh, và đồng thời là nó có một vấn đề mắc tiền, thì thế nên nó không được chi trả, và không chi trả bảo hiểm, và bệnh nhân nào mà hoặc là rất nặng và thì có thể được sử dụng. Nếu mà bệnh nhân nào mà có thể có khả năng chi trả thì đây là một cái thuốc tốt.
Alright. The next question is that, can you tell us more about the effect of drugs like statin, fibric, resin on LDL-C or HDL-C?
Which type of drug was that? Resins?
Yeah, resin, statin, and fibric.
The resins, their bile acid sequestrants, are almost never used anymore in the United States because they come with complications in the gastrointestinal tract. But they were the first drugs to ever prove that they do reduce coronary disease by binding bile acids in the gut and forcing their secretion. The liver uses cholesterol to make more bile acids and ultimately increase LDL receptors. So in general, the resins may lower ApoB about 8%, 10% at best, not very strong. Fibric acids are basically no longer used in this country unless there is extreme elevations of triglycerides above 500. And that's because none of the fibric acid trials have shown that they reduce coronary artery disease, at least the fenofibrate trials. So they're a niche drug that are used to treat very high triglycerides. As far as their ApoB lowering ability, about 10% with the fibric acid. What any of these drugs do to HDL cholesterol does not matter because HDL cholesterol is not a goal of therapy. But in general, fibrates can raise HDL cholesterol 10%, but it's meaningless. That has nothing to do with what a fibrate does. The bile acid sequestrants, by the way, the rosins, can raise HDL cholesterol 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter. But again, that's not a goal of therapy, so it does not matter what a rosin does to HDL cholesterol.
Tiếp theo là một câu hỏi về ảnh hưởng của các thuốc khác như là statin, nhóm acid fibric và nhóm resin lên các chỉ số về mỡ máu. Thì các bác sĩ nói là về nhóm statin đã nói rồi, còn hai nhóm được đề cập đến là nhóm resin và nhóm acid fibric thì đều là những thuốc mà không được sử dụng ở Mỹ. Lý do mà nhóm resin không sử dụng bởi vì nó có ảnh hưởng lên các tiêu hóa, và ví dụ là nó không mạnh, có thể giảm 80% OB thôi. Còn về nhóm fibric thì gặp những cái đề là tăng cái triglycerid lên hơn 500. Và ngoài ra thì các cái tác dụng của nó lên việc là giảm ApoB và giảm chỉ số khác thì không đủ tốt, nên là hiện tại là hai nhóm này đều không được sử dụng ở...
Yes, all right. The next question is, could you explain about the TG-HDL ratio and ApoB, ApoA1 ratio?
Ratios are not recommended to use anymore because of the weakness of ApoA1 or HDL cholesterol. We know that changing HDL cholesterol or ApoA1 does not bring with it cardioprotection. So those ratios can be deceiving. You're putting too much weight on the denominator, which has no relationship to outcomes. So you should just stick to ApoB, LDL cholesterol, or non-HDL cholesterol. No guideline recommends measuring ApoA1 or using it for anything anymore. So the triglyceride HDL ratio is used as a crude predictor of insulin resistance because, as I explained during the lecture, people with insulin resistance, pre-diabetes or diabetes, tend to have increased triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol because the triglycerides invade the HDL particles. So as that ratio goes up, it's an indicator that the person likely has some degree of insulin resistance. Also, as that ratio goes up, ApoB goes up, up, up. So the triglyceride HDL ratio is just a weak predictor of ApoB and insulin resistance. Now, if you're not measuring ApoB, it's fine to use that, but it's basically an indicator of ApoB.
Tiếp theo là về câu hỏi về cái giải thích của cái tỷ số TG trên HDL và cái tỷ số ApoB trên ApoA1. Thì theo bác sĩ thì lý do mà người ta không sử dụng cái tỷ số này để trong cái điều trị, bởi vì là cái tỷ số này có cái tính tương quan rất ít đối với cái biến cố về tim mạch, và cái chỉ số này nó chỉ có một chút giá trị để nghĩ về ApoB thôi. Còn ngoài ra cái tính tương quan với các cái tỷ lệ bệnh thì sẽ là các biến cố trong tương lai nó không cao như người ta sử dụng.
All right. And now is the very last question. Today, the total lipid test is less clinically indicated. The testing of each lipid component has become more significant in diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. So do you still have a lipid test, and do you use many biomarker tests in the diagnosis?
Look, as far as a lipid test, the best thing, and it's free, is to look at the standard lipid panel and calculate non-HDL cholesterol. It is the lipid concentration that most correlates with ApoB. So for those that you can't measure ApoB, you want to really just look at non-HDL cholesterol. If it's elevated, you want to bring it down to the goal. The goal varies depending on the underlying risk of the patient. So non-HDL cholesterol, look, I do lipid panels on everybody, but I also do ApoB on everybody. So you have the best of both worlds in ascertaining it. Most places where they're not doing ApoB or it's hard to get, non-HDL cholesterol is your most important metric that correlates with ApoB. The other thing is the first thing you always look at in a lipid profile is triglycerides, because if it happens to be above 500, that takes precedence over any cholesterol measurement, because those people are at risk for pancreatitis. So if in extreme elevations of triglycerides, you use lifestyle and drugs that can lower triglycerides. Once the triglyceride drops to below 500, then you refocus on ApoB and non-HDL cholesterol. So there's some nuances with this. The other thing I'd like to answer, I saw there was a question on pitavastatin for Asian people. And there is no doubt that Asian people seem to be very sensitive to the effect of statins and have more side effects. And this is why, in general, the dose of a statin used in an Asian is much lower than it would be in a North American or European. Of all of the statins, and it was developed in Japan, so there's a tremendous amount of research with pitavastatin in Asian people, and it does seem to be the best statin for an Asian person if it's available. In this country, pitavastatin is still a branded statin, so it's more expensive than generic statins, so it doesn't get used as much. But I think for an Asian person, that's the statin somebody should start with. And, you know, only in the extreme cases where you need really potent lowering of ApoB or LDL cholesterol would you try a different statin. But even the other statins, when used in Asian people, you should never dose them as high as we would here in North America, or at least you'd build up the dose to make sure the patient is not experiencing side effects or drug-drug interactions. I see a question here also that says, do I prescribe statins for young people less than 40 years old with high LDL? Absolutely. There are many guidelines tell you when to use a statin with high HDL cholesterol, and it's even given to pediatric populations that have familial hypercholesterolemia. Statins are approved from age like 6 and above if you have an LDL cholesterol above 190 milligrams per deciliter. That's probably 5 millimoles per liter. So yes, age has nothing to do with who gets a statin. Gender has nothing to do with who gets a statin, except we don't tend to use them in pregnant women or in women who are desiring to get pregnant. A statin is usually withheld then. But even now, in say a woman with severe atherosclerotic disease or familial hypercholesterolemia, once she's in the second or third trimester, statins can be used. So in general, not in a pregnant woman, but the biggest mistake with statins is to wait till somebody is 40 years old before you treat LDL cholesterol or ApoB. That's too late. We must start earlier in life.
Ok, câu hỏi tiếp theo là có hai câu hỏi. Thì câu hỏi đầu tiên đấy là bác sĩ thì có sử dụng cái bộ test lipid trong cái việc mà được chuẩn đoán hay không? Thì cái câu trả lời là trong cái bộ test lipid cơ bản thì bác sĩ thứ nhất là cái non HDL, nhưng mà ở chỗ của bác sĩ thì bác sĩ có cả ApoB nữa, nên là bác sĩ khuyến cáo là nếu bác sĩ sử dụng có cả ApoB và HDL thì cũng phải làm cả hai. Còn nếu trong cái trường hợp mà hầu hết cơ sở là sẽ không có ApoB thì cái chỉ số quan trọng nhất là bạn nên nhìn vào trong cái một số điều trị, đấy là non HDL. Và trong việc điều trị thì tôi khuyến cáo là khi mà dùng một cái bộ test lipid thì cũng nên là để ý cái chỉ số triglycerid TM. Thì trong cái trường hợp mà cái chỉ số triglycerid này nó trên 500 thì các bạn có thể em ok nói cái đối sống để mục đích là điều trị nó, và sau khi nó xuống dưới 500 rồi thì sẽ quay lại với các cái chất điều trị như ở các bệnh nhân bình thường. Còn có một lưu ý bác sĩ muốn nói đấy là ở dân châu Á thì dường như cái việc sử dụng statin bị cảm hơn, nên là bác sĩ khuyến cáo mọi người đấy là khi đến với bệnh nhân thì sẽ không sử dụng liều tương tự như liều khuyến cáo ở Âu hoặc Mỹ, liều tăng dần chỉ tối đa cái tác dụng phụ cho bệnh nhân. Và đồng thời lúc trả lời chị cũng gặp một câu hỏi của bạn ở trong phần bình luận, thì bạn hỏi là bệnh nhân mà dưới 40 tuổi thì có được sử dụng statin không, thì bác sĩ cũng trả lời câu thứ hai này, đấy là bác sĩ sẽ cho dùng statin bất kể tuổi tác hoặc là giới tính. Và đối tượng duy nhất là người bác sĩ cần phải để trước khi sử dụng statin với bệnh nhân là đang mang thai hoặc là mong muốn thai thời gian tới thì là sẽ cần phải cân nhắc nhiều hơn. Còn ở các đối tượng khác thì là bác sĩ vẫn sử dụng statin như bình thường.
Okay, so due to the time restriction, we will transfer the remaining questions to you if there are any. So thank you very much, Dr. Dayspring, today for sharing with us, all of the Vietnamese physicians and medical students, a very informative session. We really appreciate your time and effort with us. Thank you also, Tùng, for your translation.
Yes, you're very welcome. It was a great pleasure to do this.
Medicator rất cảm ơn quý bác sĩ đã tham gia và đặt câu hỏi cho bác sĩ Dayspring. Hiện tại mình vẫn còn một vài câu hỏi chưa được giải đáp. Do thời lượng chương trình có hạn nên Medicator sẽ tổng hợp những câu hỏi này và gửi qua email đến bác sĩ sau buổi ngày hôm nay và gửi lại câu trả lời cho tất cả các bạn qua email. Với những câu hỏi thêm dành cho diễn giả thì mọi người vui lòng gửi vào hòm thư của Medicator tại help@medicator.com. Xin mời mọi người tham gia nhóm Facebook liên kết bác sĩ Medicator để có thể cập nhật thêm các kiến thức y khoa và tham gia các buổi hội thảo tương tự. Trên màn hình hiện tại là bản khảo sát chất lượng hội thảo về buổi hội thảo trực tuyến cùng với một bài khảo sát nhỏ về chủ đề ngày hôm nay và sẽ hoàn toàn ẩn danh. Xin mời các bác sĩ trả lời khảo sát. Trên thang 1 là chưa hài lòng và 5 là rất hài lòng. Medicator mong muốn có thể mang lại trải nghiệm tốt nhất dành cho quý khán giả trong buổi hội thảo sắp tới. Medicator xin cảm ơn và hẹn gặp lại các bác sĩ trong buổi hội thảo tiếp theo.